Hey guys, and welcome. In the previous video we have discussed Target defense, improved Target defense, and the new main line with the bishop to f4. This time, in this video, we're going to cover Carlsbad pawn structure and the old main line with the bishop to g5. So let's get started. After moves d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to c3, knight to f6, the main line that we're going to cover a bit later is bishop to g5. Right now, I want to spend some time on discussing the consequences of the exchange on d5. This may look a bit counterintuitive because white actually played c4 to force black to take on c4 to get a better control over central squares. But the thing is, it leads to a classic Carlsbad pawn structure, this or that way, which is quite good for white. White has a variety of different plans there. And when you have a choice, it's usually very good, right? After e takes d5, which is the main continuation here, white continues with the bishop to g5 move. So developing the bishop on the same square where white usually develops it without even taking on d5. Black continues with the bishop e7 move. White continues with the e3. And after c6, we have exactly this Carlsbad pawn structure. So it is defined by pawns e3, d4 against d5 and c6. So this pawn structure is a classic one. If you know what to play here with black or white, you will be good. Moreover, the similar pawn structure may arise with changed colors. So sometimes in Caracan, when white plays the exchange variation, we get exactly the same pawn structure but reversed. So learning this pawn structure, you'll be ready to play different openings again. In this position, you may wonder why black played c6. So it's important to protect d5 pawn still, although white has exchanged the c4 pawn, but there are still possibilities to exert some pressure on d5 with the help of pieces. Since there is no longer a pawn on e6, of course, black's natural idea is to develop the light squared bishop, which is a problem in Queen's Gambit. But immediate development of that bishop will be wrong. For example, after bishop f5 move, white may play queen to b3, immediately attacking b7, which is now hanging after bishop to f5 move, simultaneously exerting pressure on d5. And if black protects the one, another drops. So remember, bishop goes to g5 to exert pressure on knight f6. Knight f6 is the only defender of e4 square. Knight f6 is the main defender of e4 and d5 squares. In this particular case, after exchange of this knight, d5 drops. So now white can take on d5. I think the easiest is to capture with the queen, simplifying things and playing the position with the extra material. That's why black starts with the c6 move prior to developing the bishop on f5. Because after c6, first of all, the pawn on d5 is protected in a very safe way. And whenever white tries something like queen to b3 attacking b7, there is always queen b6, protecting it efficiently. So, since black is ready to occupy f5 square, it's very logical for white to combine his development with preventing bishop to f5 move. Normally, white has two options here. They are queen to c2 and bishop to d3. It's not very important which move you choose because normally they both lead to the same position. Let's try queen to c2 here. So bishop f5 is prevented. Since bishop f5 is prevented, there is no other good square for the bishop on this diagonal, and black normally waits until there is something better than, for example, e6 square. So many beginners actually occupy e6 square with the bishop, but this is completely wrong because bishop is not doing anything there. So knight to d7 is a better move, much more flexible development. Then white develops the bishop to d3. And now black can castle, obviously. Another way to play this position is to play knight to h5, which looks a bit strange at first glance, but it has one interesting idea behind it. First of all, the bishops are being exchanged, so black slightly simplifies the things. After bishop takes e7 and queen takes e7, black no longer has to think of what to do with the dark squared bishop, how to activate it. It's just exchanged. The queen is now a bit more active than on d8. And black also has very interesting idea. After knight to e2, white's normal development here, black plays g6. It may look very strange, but let's have a look further. So castling. let's say knight goes to b6. By the way, it was possible to castle short as well, so white has a choice here after queen to c2. For example, king goes to b1, some sort of prophylaxis just to go away from the c file. And here, black plays knight to g7. So that was the idea behind g6 move. So black wants to do what? Just to play bishop f5, next move, getting rid of the bad light square bishop. Very interesting maneuver. But if white is smart, he or she prevents it and plays knight to g3. And it's hard for black to get rid of that bishop. Knight on g3 is not necessarily that active as well, but anyway, it's a bit better than this bishop limited with all pawns. Black normally plays something like bishop e6. White should be better in this position because his pieces are just more active, but this position is quite solid. It's not necessarily so bad for black. Let's get back a bit to the moment where black had a choice between knight h5 and castling. I offer to remember this idea with the exchange of light square bishop because it is very typical. Sometimes you may find examples that feature another maneuver. So black keeps the bishop on the board and plays something like knight f8, knight e6, then g6, knight g7, and eventually bishop to f5. So it may look very strange, but now you know what it is. So getting rid of the light square bishop is kind of very good for black. Let's focus on castling. So black castles here, and now white has two major directions, two main plans. The one is a plan of Botvinnik. So it is the development of the knight to e2 with the idea to use the pawn f2 for supporting e4 a bit later. For example, rook goes to e8, white castles, knight usually goes to f8, so also very typical thing. So now knight protects h7 and there is no threat of taking on f6 and taking on h7. And after that, white continues with the f3. So position remains quite complicated, so black has some interesting ways to play against this plan, but it was proved to be very, very annoying for black. So the idea is very simple. White wants to play e4 very soon, opening the f file in case of exchange on e4 for the rook f1 with further pressure on the king side, while black is still struggling to complete his development. Most likely the best plan for black is the preparation of the c6, c5 with some counterplay in the center. Another direction for white is the so-called minority attack. In this situation, instead of playing knight to e2, white plays knight to f3 instead. By the way, it's also possible with the knight to e2, but with the knight on f3, it's a bit easier to implement. So knight goes to f3, rook goes to e8, castling. Same thing, knight goes to f8, preparing the regrouping, sort of knight e6, g6, knight g7 is possible now. And then white just plays rook a to b1, preparing b4 move. So the basic idea here is to play b4 and then b5. White's a minority because white has a minority on the queen side. Let's say black prevents it with the a5, then white prepares it with the a3. For example, black jumps with the knight to e4, typical thing to reduce the pressure. Then bishop takes e7, queen takes e7. As you may notice, knight on e4 is protected, but white just continues with his plan. Pawn goes to b4 and then to b5 very soon. Let's say takes, knight goes to g6 and b5. So the idea is simple. If black captures on b5, then there is a weakness on d5. If black doesn't capture, white captures himself, and either pawn on c6 will be weak after this exchange, for instance, or if on c6 is a piece after the exchange, then again, d5 is weak. So that's it for Carlsbad. Let's get back to the main line. So in this position, white plays bishop to g5, not taking on d5, not defining the pawn structure yet. The idea is very simple, pinning the knight, exerting additional pressure on e4 and d5 squares. Black usually responds with the bishop to e7, what can be more natural than this. And white continues with the knight to f3. Obviously, it's always possible to get back to Carlsbad, but that is not what white is going to do in this particular case. So here, normally you start with the h6 move. There is a little detail that may make you want to make this move prior to making castling, because if you start with castling, I mean, it's not necessarily wrong, but there are some lines where you may not be able to kick the bishop from g5. For example, after e3, knight to d7, for instance, queen goes to c2, already controlling the long diagonal b1, h7. If you play h6 here, let's say, white may consider playing h4. And now, after castling long, white will start the attack on the king side. The problem with this, I mean with capturing on g5, is that after h takes g5, the h file is open and white has the access to h7 square. So after gf6 and knight f6 here are not checkmated immediately, but white has very annoying initiative here after bishop d3 and bishop to h7. So obviously you don't have to take on g5, but then it's not so simple to get rid of the bishop on g5. If we go a bit back and start with the h6 move, then you will see that in this case h4 makes no sense. So white is definitely forced to either go away with the bishop or take on f6. Capture on f6 can make sense as well, because after bishop takes f6, you will have not necessarily that good bishop, right? Sometimes this is combined with switching to the Carlsbad pawn structure and then playing e3, limiting this bishop. And then most likely the plan of the minority attack will be the most promising for white. Sometimes white tries to play this without taking on d5, simply e3, preparing the development of the bishop. Black castles. White may start with rook to c1. And here we're going to discuss one important method for black to actually change the situation in the center. There are several. One of them is the preparation of the c5, but in this particular case, since we don't have the knight on f6, d5 is less protected, which means c5 will be complicated. So in this case, black is trying a different thing. So everything starts with the c6 to avoid any sort of things with the knight to b5, potentially. Then after bishop to d3, black plays knight to d7, controlling e5 square. And after castling, black first captures on c4, and then after bishop takes c4, plays e5. That's the thing here. So again, we undermine the central pawn, but from the other side. Not c5, but e5. And here it makes even more sense because we have pair of bishops, so we want to open up a position, and there is no good way for white to actually keep the advantage in the center. So most likely you will face something like h3 here. After the exchange on d4, white will have an isolated pawn. Knight to d4 is obviously possible as well, but then black's knight will get some nice squares on c5 or e5 potentially. And in this case, after knight to b6, bishop to b3, and bishop to f5, black has a comfortable position in my opinion, simply developing the worst piece, the light squared bishop, having some pressure on d4, so no problems, I suppose. Let's get back to bishop to h4. So after h6, white decides to keep the bishop on the board and plays bishop to h4, still exerting some pressure on the knight. Be not afraid of something like g5 because it will just weaken black's king side, and black normally just castles. In this case, after e3, black has different options, but I want to focus on the classic one, the one I used to play myself. So it is the b6. It's very natural and, in my opinion, quite solid. So what is the idea? It is simple, just to prepare the development of the light squared bishop, which is quite bad here on c8 and doesn't have perspectives on the initial diagonal. And another idea is just to play c5, so that after exchanges we will have a chance to recapture with the pawn, so that we will avoid the pattern with the isolated pawn. Here, white may play different things, including queen c2, rook c1, bishop to d3, and so on. So let's have a look at several options. First of all, bishop to d3, simply preparing the development, simply continuing the development and preparing castling. Bishop goes to b7, also natural continuation, white castles. Then black continues with the knight to d7, very flexible square for the knight. It's ready to replace the knight on f6 in case of defense, so that the bishop doesn't lose the control over c5 square. And black is ready to counterattack with the c7, c5. Normally white continues with the queen e2, again very typical thing, controlling e4 potentially, maybe supporting it, and also preparing rook to d1 and another rook to c1. And black just plays c5 here, undermining the center. And this may lead to a very typical case, I mean the situation with hanging pawns, but there are different things possible. So after, for example, capturing on d5, we may consider taking with the pawn. Taking with the knight may be also interesting, although I usually prefer taking with the pawn. And after, say, d takes c5 and b takes c5, we have a double-edged position, which is also a classical pattern, a very important strategic situation with hanging pawns on c5 and d5. White will try to do something to attack these pawns. Black will support these pawns and prepare some sort of d5, d4 breakthrough. As I have already mentioned, playing something like c4 is not recommended because knight may go to d4. And white may also use this square with literally any other piece. So for white, I think it's a natural idea to just exert some pressure on these pawns, prevent d4, or maybe just think of playing a3, b4. It's also one of the possibilities to either create a position with the isolated pawn or force c5, c4. Another option for white is just to capture on d5. Let's get back to it. So right after black played b6, white captures on d5. So what's the idea behind this? Actually, if you take with the e6 pawn here, you're kind of forced to play the position with the hanging pawns. Now you have no choice. I mean, there is no longer a possibility to build anything else because the Carlsbad pawn structure no longer works. The pawn on c6 will be quite vulnerable here. Moreover, it's not necessarily that simple to get the desired position after bishop to d3, bishop to b7, castling, knight to d7, and rook to c1. We can see that if you play c5 exactly here, and I think you should, white is a bit better prepared for attack against this pawn. So something like knight to a4 may be slightly annoying. But it's not necessarily a great improvement for white if compared to the previous line we have discussed. That is just about the better option for black that exists. So instead of taking on d5 with the pawn, it's possible to simplify position a bit with a help of capturing with the knight. So let's get back to that option. So black captures on d5 with the knight here and offers the exchange of dark squared bishops. So after something like bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, there's always like an option of e4, but in that case we may take on c3 and play bishop to b7. It will be just like Tarish improved, but not quite, because we're not going to play c7, c5 immediately. We may prepare it with the comfort. So for some time we will have pretty safe position in the center, I guess. And another option for white is anyway to take on d5 to get this pattern with not really possible Carlsbad for black. So black will be forced to play c5 a bit later. Let's say rook goes to c1, exerting some pressure on the c file. Then bishop goes to e6. This is a bit strange, but as you can see, there is no longer the knight on f6, so we need someone to protect d5. And bishop hands goes to e6. It's also possible to put it on b7, but on a6 it's a bit more flexible in case the pawn on c5 is exchanged, because then after d4 there will be some pressure on a2 probably. But I do believe it's a question of taste for this position. So now if white tries to prevent c5 with the queen c2, black has rook to c8, just preparing it. It's important that the knight is still here controlling c6 square, so white cannot use any of his pieces to blockade the pawn on c7. It would be terrible for black, of course. Another option is to put the queen on a4, very interesting one, by the way, because after c5, white has this maneuver, queen to a3, pinning the pawn, because queen is hanging in case pawn moves, and hence exerting some, at first glance, annoying pressure. But black has enough resources to protect the pawn on c5, so rook goes to c8. White has to continue his development. Let's say bishop goes to e2. Now black plays a5. May look a bit strange, weakening b5 square, but black is preparing the following maneuver. After castling, the queen goes away from the pin to a7, still protecting the pawn on c5. And now c5 pawn may move, and actually it's possible to think of something like c4 followed by b5, b4, exploiting the fact that the queen is a bit misplaced in that case, and black has sort of majority if we talk about cb and a files. So here I think it's a good moment for white to capture. And after dc5 and bc5, once again we get the position with hanging pawns, which is a classic pattern. Here a5 helps black prevent b4, which will either force c4 or actually destroy this situation so that there will be an isolated pawn at d5. And the rest is actually dependent on your strength. So this position is playable from both perspectives. You may play something like knight d7, rook b8 with black. Sometimes you may find interesting to try something like c4, for example, even though losing the control over d4, but fixing the pawn on b2. If you have enough resources to attack along the b file, you may try that. And white will do the same stuff, just like in any position with hanging pawns. So white will just bring the rook to d1, let's say, and will try to attack these guys. Although, since we have exchanged several pieces, it's no longer that simple. So this wraps up the portion about Queen's Gambit declined. In the next video, we're going to discuss one interesting trap, actually the elephant trap. And as for this portion, as you can see, it leads to very solid positions, either in bishop g5 line or bishop f4 line. To play this efficiently with either white or black, you have to be patient, of course. And, well, I would recommend to learn classics as well, because there are a lot of classic games featuring the positions we have discussed, as well as some new modern classics featuring super top players. I hope you found this video useful. So see you next videos. Thanks for your attention.